Executive Suites, made possible in part by the generous support of the Rhode Island Foundation. Now, Executive Suites with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
When Providence startup Nabsys opened its new facility in the Jewelry District in 2011, plenty of prominent officials showed up for the ribbon cutting. Founded 7 years ago to develop a faster, cheaper way of sequencing DNA, Nabsys has attracted more than $45 million in venture capital funding, and today employs more than 50 people, making it a much-discussed local success story. So what's next for Nabsys, and how does Providence's nascent knowledge economy look from their vantage point? This week on Executive Suite, the co-founder and CEO of Nabsys, Dr. Barrett Bready. Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Barrett, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So I'm not good at science. I want the viewers to be confident. I'm going to be your advocate here to make sure we understand, because Barrett has many degrees and is much smarter than I am at this stuff. But I think everyone can understand the premise of what you're doing at Nabsys. It's really fascinating. So let's just start with the basics. I mentioned a little top. It's about DNA. It's about DNA sequencing, but a different approach. What do you do at Nabsys?
Yeah, so fundamentally what we do is we make semiconductor-based devices for looking at DNA. So these are actually, I have one here, if I can show it.
Please do, yeah, hold it right up.
So this is fundamentally what we make at Nabsys. So you can see it looks just like a computer chip. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's made in the same places you'd make a chip for consumer electronics applications. Mm-hmm. But in the Nabsys case, DNA molecules physically flow through this chip, and they're read electronically as they go through. So it's a brand new way of looking at DNA, and it's specifically really good at getting out the types of information that are key to cancer as well as other diseases.
So you mentioned cancer right there, and one of the things you said to the Journal a couple of years ago was that you talked about the difference between a healthy cell and a cancer cell and how that fits in with what you do. I think people will be interested in that. What was sort of that story you were telling?
Yeah, sure. So, if you know someone who's been through cancer treatment, you know that historically, and even most of the time now, chemotherapy is extremely toxic, extremely unpleasant. And the reason for that is that the DNA of a cancer cell is really similar to the DNA of a healthy cell in that patient. And that's why it's really hard to distinguish between those two, and that's why you kill the cancer cells with chemotherapy, but you also kill a lot of healthy cells, so you get all the side effects. But it turns out that cancer cells have DNA that actually differs in characteristic ways from DNA in healthy cells in the same patient. And
which kind of makes sense, right? If it has cancer,
right?
So it would be different.
Yeah, there's something that's making it cancer, and there's certain types of changes that are characteristic, and this is really good at looking at those. And the idea is, if you can target therapy to cells that have those kinds of changes, you can make something that's much less toxic and much more effective. And you're seeing some of those in sort of the dawn of personalized medicine, where you have these very targeted treatments that have much fewer side effects and are much more effective for certain types of cancer.
And you said the phrase right there, personalized medicine. That comes up a lot when you're hearing about Nabsys, and people are probably hearing it now about other companies and other treatments too. What does that mean exactly? Our doctors would say that all our medicine is personalized, to what we need doing. But I know it has a very specific meaning when you talk about that. What is that?
Yeah. So it's not because it has personalized in it. It's not we're going to develop a brand new drug for you.
Yeah, there won't be a Ted Nesi chemotherapy.
It's really, we're going to make sure that we give you the best drug or the best cocktail of drugs based on the details of your disease. So, historically people talk about lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, but you probably heard people starting to talk about cancer that has certain types of markers. It's positive for this marker, it's negative for that marker. And they talk less about what organ it might have started in and more about the details at a genetic level of that cancer. And so that's sort of, the biggest promise of personalized medicine is that you'll be able to, kind of feel the same way about cancer that you now feel about infectious disease, right? So if you get sick, it doesn't usually cross your mind that you're going to die, right? Because you have antibiotics and you're in pretty good shape, and the idea is to get cancer to that same point.
Now,
it's without casting without undermining how much work it has been to get here, it almost sounds obvious, right? Of course you'd want to find the most personal treatment for someone, and you'd want to look at this DNA and everything, but I know it's been very complicated to get here. What's different about Nabsys? What are you able to do to make this, personalized medicine a reality that hasn't been possible or has been very difficult up till now? What's the Nabsys difference?
Yeah, so, I should really point out, we're working in an ecosystem, right? And we're not sort of solving this problem on our own. But you hear a lot these days about DNA sequencing, and DNA sequencing gives you it typically looks at really small pieces of DNA and tries to put those together into bigger pieces, and those pieces are analogous to the pieces to a jigsaw puzzle, where the puzzle is the whole genome, and the pieces are the biggest pieces you can kind of put together. And it turns out that with sequencing technology, because they look at really tiny pieces, they look at 100,000th of the genome at a time, something like this. They're only able to put those into really small pieces. And so in the analogy, sequencing gives you pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. Nabsys gives you the picture on the box, right? Sort of, it's the zoomed out big picture version of where all these things go. It's called structural information. What's the structure of the genome? And it turns out that structural information is key to cancer. So that's one thing. The other thing is, even within an individual tumor, not all of the genomes in each cell are the same, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity. And so, the analogy is, if the president's going to speak in an auditorium, the Secret Service doesn't want to know whether the average person in the room is trying to kill him. Right? He wants to know, is there anyone in the room trying to kill him? And if so, who is it? And similarly, the oncologist doesn't want to know only whether the average cell in his patient's tumor will respond to his choice of therapy. He wants to know, are there any cells that won't? And if so, which ones are they and how many are there? And so what Nabsys can do is not just take an average signal of a bunch of DNA molecules, it can actually get a signal from a single molecule. So it can characterize the heterogeneity that might be in a mixed sample. And because we're doing this in a semiconductor-based framework, we can take advantage of the really impressive way in which semiconductor devices can scale.
So it's partly about technology. People are thinking here probably a lot about medicine and laboratories, but it's also about the same technology in a way that has made our iPhone so powerful now.
Yeah, so it's really a hybrid of the two worlds. So, for example, on our board, we have people who are life sciences, biotech people. We also have semiconductor people. So Ray Stata, who's the founder of Analog Devices, is one of a small number of people in the world to found a company and still run it after it's worth more than $10 billion. He's on our board. So it's really sort of a fusion of those two worlds.
Now, when I was working on this story, I was reminded of some of the pieces that came out after the 10-year anniversary of the Human Genome Project. Yeah. And there was the one in the New York Times, a perfect example. 10 years after President Bill Clinton announced the first draft of the human genome was complete, medicine has yet to see any large part of the promised benefits. And the sense was that it was a disappointment, or at least hadn't led to things as quickly as we thought it would. What's your take on that? Is that, have genomes been overrated? Has this work been, is it overpromised to the average person on what this would lead to? Or is it just, we just got to give it a little time to really see the impacts?
Yeah, I mean, those headlines are really entertaining. I used to give a presentation where it started with headlines I pulled out of the financial press, one of which was, did the failure of the Human Genome Project cause the financial crisis?
Wow.
So, I think there are a couple things going on. One is, whenever there's a scientific breakthrough, people always think that the real world applications are to follow more quickly than they actually end up doing. Mm-hmm. Another is, we have built, as a community, really impressive tools over the last decade. So if you look at the cost per base of information that can be produced by some of these leading technologies, it's gone down by over a factor of 1 million in a 10-year period. So it's gone down faster even than Moore's law in semiconductors. But we still don't have all the tools that we need to do that. But make no mistake about it, genomics, personalized medicine is really going to be very important to the future of medicine. And I think anyone who's actually had a loved one who's been treated by a targeted cancer therapy that did not exist a couple of years ago really understands sort of the difference between that and what we had a few years ago.
Oh, fascinating. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk much more about Nabsys, its role in the growing knowledge economy, and also Barrett's service on the I195 Commission. 2 weeks in a row, we're talking about I195. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and I'm pleased to be joined this week by the co-founder and CEO of Nabsys, one of the most talked about biotech companies in Rhode Island, in Providence, Dr. Barrett Bready. And Barrett, I say there, Dr. Barrett Bready, you are a real live doctor. You went to Brown Medical School, you have the degrees and everything, and yet you went and you actually became a CEO instead of being a general practitioner. How did that happen?
Sure, yeah. So first, Brown has a pretty unusual program. It's called the PLME, Program in Liberal Medical Education. You actually apply out of high school, you're accepted into undergrad and medical school at the same time, and so it offers you a lot of freedom. So I did that thinking I wanted to practice medicine, but I wasn't one of those people who grew up wanting to be a doctor, so the year before I wanted to be an architect. So it wasn't like a lifelong dream, but I thought I might want to do that, and as an undergrad I ended up studying physics, but I did a lot of biophysics, biotech type stuff, so my thesis work was on applying chaos theory to EKG signals to predict risk of sudden cardiac death non-invasively. And then I did this work for a medical device company, which went really well, and they marketed the product that I co-invented, and it went really well. And so by the time I got to medical school, I decided I really wanted to go to medical school, but I really wanted to do it so I could go into what I was calling biotech, basically life sciences entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. So I set up these different biotech initiatives at Brown at the time, one of which was called the elective in biotechnology. So in third and fourth year of medical school, you rotate through different clinical rotations. And I added to that list for-profit life sciences biotech companies. And in doing that, I kind of got a really good sort of picture of the landscape. And I was like, oh, that genomics thing is going to be big. Regenerative medicine, things like stem cells is going to be really big. So
this would be like early 2000s. You were in med school.
Yeah. So I was in med school from 1999 to 2003. Yeah. And so I ended up co-founding companies sort of shortly after finishing med school in both those spaces, genomics and regenerative medicine. And Nabsys is the genomics one. So I think it's great. Life sciences, biotech is great for people who sort of enjoy business and entrepreneurship, but want to know that what they're doing is going to have a really important impact on society and humanity and medicine. And
the company has really had some growth in recent years. Can you give the viewers a sense of the growth just even in the last 5 years or so? You've gone from being a very small operation to now about 50 employees. Tell me about sort of the trajectory up to now.
Yeah, so I was employee number one for a little while, and then we actually, believe it or not, when Nabsys had only one employee, we merged or acquired a company that had also spun out of Brown, out of the computer science department, and that was headed by a guy named John Oliver, who's now the vice president of research and development at Nabsys. And 2009, we did our first venture financing, and since then we've raised about $50 million in venture financing and hired some really smart people. And what's interesting about Nabsys is you have people from all different disciplines. So you have some people are engineers, some people are computer scientists, some people who are biologists, biochemists, and a lot of it's sort of a real mixture of pretty smart people from different places.
And I know part of the last round of funding you secured was to actually start to sell the product, right? How's that going?
So we are in what's called early access in the business. So okay. What that means is that we have sort of selected key customers. They're some of the sort of most sophisticated, what are called genome centers in the world, and we sort of do initial projects with them before we sort of go out commercially more broadly, but it's going very well so far.
Now, who would your customers be eventually? I mean, how broadly do you see people wanting to use the technology Nabsys has come up with? I'm curious what you see as the market reach eventually.
Yeah, so there are kind of different phases to that. So first phase is in research. So it's anyone who's doing DNA sequencing who wants to, going with the analogy before, take those puzzle pieces and actually put them together to sort of get the big picture. Sequencing is very unevenly distributed right now. So the sort of half a dozen places in the world actually sequence the majority of all DNA. So those are called genome centers. Yeah. And beyond that, sort of academic institutions like universities. And then from there, it goes to more clinical applications, so diagnostic applications. So running a test to be able to figure out, what chemotherapy to give, that sort of thing. And then beyond that, right, because it's just, this chip, right, and this is sort of solid-state device, you can see this going anywhere. So beyond that are what are called field deployable applications. So things like, there's an outbreak, we're going to monitor the outbreak, or we're going to make sure that your food or your water is safe and free of harmful bacteria, things like that.
And you mentioned about $50 million in venture capital funding so far for Nabsys. What's the relationship with those VC investors like? I mean, how much pressure is there on you to ramp up faster and to get to profitability? And how much are they particularly patient with the sense of that long-term vision you just said?
It depends on the month, right?
Yeah.
But so the investors have been great. They kind of understand how big the promise is here, and in general, even some of the really big companies, they might have market caps. Companies in this space that a few years ago weren't worth very much money now have. A company called Illumina has a $20 billion market cap, and even at that size, they're really very much focused on growing to future business, future applications, because they understand that while this market is significant now, it's going to be so much bigger a few years from now. So they're really kind of investing in the future.
Reminds me of Amazon, actually, too, where they keep the profits just as low as they can to keep growing. All right, we're going to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the ecosystem of these sorts of companies in Providence, as well as Barrett's service on the I-195 Redevelopment District Commission. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi, and we're talking today with Nabsys CEO Dr. Barrett Bready. And Barrett, have you ever considered taking Nabsys out of Rhode Island? There aren't that many companies like yours here, so it might even be surprising to people that you're here.
Yeah, so I definitely get that question a lot. And Nabsys is in Providence sort of for historical reasons, in the sense that it formed from the merger of two companies that spun out of Brown. A lot of the early folks had Brown connections. I teach a course there. Some people have been former, sort of full-time professors or students at Brown. More recently, that we have basically just as many people with connections to MIT as we do to Brown. But I think that people don't understand the potential of Providence for having a larger life sciences cluster. So close to half of our employees actually live in Massachusetts, and they commute. And frequently, their previous jobs were in Cambridge. And it actually doesn't take them any more time to get to Providence than it would to get to Cambridge. So I think that there's a lot of possibility, a lot of potential to have more companies like Nabsys in the area. But for me, I love Providence, and it's also nice if you're relocating someone from another part of the country, and they want to buy a house. That they're much happier with the cost of real estate, especially if they're not moving from a really expensive part of the world.
Yeah.
They're much happier with the cost of real estate in Providence than they would be in Boston, for example.
What are the biggest business challenges to you of being in Rhode Island versus somewhere else?
I think that it's the fact that there still are relatively few companies like Nabsys. So, for example, if you are relocating to another part of the country, you kind of want to convince your spouse that, hey, if I lose this job, I'm not going to have to take the kids out of school and move again,
yeah.
Right? So I think getting a critical mass actually in Providence, and also maybe sort of geography lessons so people understand that Providence actually isn't that far from Boston or Cambridge. Those are but basically creating the ecosystem. So I think a lot of people want to live in Providence because it's cool. The quality of life has a well-deserved, really positive reputation. But I think, creating that ecosystem would really help catalyze a lot more development here.
Are there steps you think could be taken now by policymakers, by others, to sort of push that forward and get that ecosystem growing more quickly?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know. If Nabsys moved to Massachusetts right now, the state of Massachusetts would give us 7 figures, over $1 million to do that. So there are incentives because Massachusetts, I think, understands that biotech or life science is going to be so big that by establishing a leadership position now, they're going to sort of reap the benefits of that for such a long time. That's why they committed, $1 billion to attracting companies there. And so I think we can do things that are kind of more targeted, better return on investment, but we need to kind of catalyze, right, sort of the beginning of this cluster so that you have enough critical mass so that companies can just sort of move there because they understand that there's an ecosystem.
I have more questions on that, but I have to ask you a little about your service on the I-195 Commission. You've been on pretty much the whole time since it started. We had Colin Kane and Jan Brody from the Commission on last week, and it was fascinating to hear their thoughts. The show's online if you want to watch. But there've been some concerning stories in the Journal in recent weeks for people who are just kind of half paying attention to it. First, that not a ton of developers showed up at the first open house, and then some of the comments from the Commission's broker about the difficulty in some ways of convincing a big developer to come do a project in Providence. Have you been at all discouraged by things in recent weeks? How are you feeling about the potential down there right now?
So it kind of follows up on what I was just saying. So nothing in recent weeks I think surprised me or anyone else on the Commission. I think that people have to understand that there are sort of economic realities, right? In terms of just because you have land available doesn't mean everyone will come in and build there, right? You need to kind of make it an attractive place for people to build and create this critical mass. So, the 195 Commission is not primarily about filling up the land with buildings. It's primarily about, if you sort of read the statute, it's primarily about economic development. And so what's really important is making sure that the right types of users that really sort of catalyze economic development, increase in GDP, not just on the land, but in the broader sort of city and state. And so because we don't have great sort of economic policies for attracting companies, I think it's an opportunity for us to use the 195 land as a crucible, as a place to do an experiment. Say, okay, let's say that just on this land, this is what our policy is, this is what our incentives are, and sort of demonstrate that it can be really powerful and that people can kind of overcome the other barriers by getting those incentives and then have lots of people there. So I think that there are really targeted things we can do, sort of with a deep understanding of what life sciences companies need, for example, and take advantage of the fact that Brown Med School is right there, the hospitals are right there, College Hill is right there, to actually start getting companies
Expand on
there.
that. What sorts of things are you thinking about?
Okay, I mean, I can give you a specific if you're interested, and if you want to kind of follow this thread, it'll take a minute. But basically, you don't want to do anything where you're sort of picking which companies are going to succeed or fail. Right? That mixture of money and politics is historically or notoriously flawed. Right?
Right.
Not just Rhode Island, but all ask people in Spain what happened in the banking crisis. Right? So, but you do want to sort of have something that says if you are
About 30 seconds left.
If you're in this sector and if you are willing to get private capital, we will help sort of match that, provided you commit in some way to this location. And doing things like that will allow just enough companies to move there that other companies will move there without the incentives after that.
All right, that's all the time we have this week, Barrett. I want to thank you very much for joining me today, and I want to thank you for tuning into the show. You can learn much more about Nabsys on their website. What's the URL?
It's nabsys.com.
Nabsys.com. Okay, you can watch some videos, try to understand it, see if you want to become a high-flying scientist and join them down there in the Knowledge District. Be sure to tune in next week and every week here on Executive Suite. And if you've missed any of this episode or any other episode of the show, you can find them all archived on our website, WPRI.com. I'm Ted Nisi. See you back here next week.